Super excited to have Andrew Hill with us here today. Andrew is the founder and CEO of a company called Textile.io. And I think he beats David. So for doing the contest for travel, he made it here from San Francisco, and I think he landed about 3 hours ago. So if he falls over, I don't know what the hell we're going to do, but we'll figure that out. But he's an expert in decentralized software, and he's going to talk about a lot that's happening in that world, together with what's happening in the world of privacy, how it relates into location data. He asked me not to say that he's an expert on anything necessarily, but I think collectively you're going to be really impressed with this talk. And like with everything today, you know, this is about the conversation and the engagement and the connections. So please think of the questions you want to ask, because we'll have time for that as we wrap up the session. And the more the merrier within reason. So with that, Andrew, thank you very much, and let's welcome him.
Yeah, it's not working.
Like an early startup, you know how busy it always feels, and so
I was afraid mine was working.
But like the overnight red eye here. So a lot of my sentences, you'll notice like this is a working title. Okay, so it might be a little backwards and crazy. Okay, how's that? Better? Is it on? Yeah? Okay, awesome. Okay, so let me start here again so that the recording gets this right. Thank you very much for CARTO for having me here. So I want to talk to you today a little bit about something that's really interesting to me. And it has to do with this concept that in technology, and especially with internet technologies, there's a giant pendulum that seems to swing. And it swings between two ideas. One is centralization and the other is decentralization. And so I want to talk about kind of 4 points. My presentation isn't really going to point at these 4 specific sections, but this idea that technology moves through these cycles of centralization to decentralization, and that I think really interesting to this conference is that the geospatial technologies was actually born into a period of centralization. And I think that's going to be something really cool to think about. And this idea that technology as a whole seems to be moving towards new ideas of decentralization and what that actually means for the geospatial industry. And then also what the impact has been on our understanding of personal data. Because a lot of the technologies that we use that use our personal data, especially in the geospatial industries, were also born in that period of centralization, which has a very unique impact on what we think about as far as personal data and our relationship to it. And then I want to spend a little bit of time telling you at the end what we're up to and how we're trying to promote this shift towards decentralization and why and what we think it can actually do and what we think this next period will be like. So first, let me tell you about a little bit about centralization and what I'm talking about here and how it has this impact on our relationship with our own personal data. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concepts of sort of the origin of the internet as we know it, and how it really started through an assemblage of organizations and universities basically self-assembling and coming up with protocols in order to send data and information amongst themselves and to one another. And this was really a really important period of technology development that was totally decentralized or overwhelmingly decentralized. So they came up with things like open protocols that still define the web as we know it. And it was controlled by the community and it had limited authority. So ideas like if you wanted to send a message on this early backbone of the internet, you could basically spin up a computer, use these protocols, connect to other computers, send a message. In the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, a number of technology companies actually built themselves on top of those early protocols. They were part of that decentralized technology, and they came out of it. But what they did is they realized that they could actually move a lot faster if they kind of closed themselves off from that. And this was the period of centralization that we saw. And really important things happened during this that were good and are still good. But these closed systems, they offered many new and improved services, and they onboarded most of the internet, most of the population of the internet that we know. That's invaluable, right? But it means that we actually interact with the internet through these technologies overwhelmingly. So a protocol, for example, that was invented for sending emails is open, and it was part of the decentralization. But most of us probably go to Google or Gmail or another service from another one of these organizations to actually send an email. We don't necessarily interact directly with the open protocol anymore. We go to a centralized system to send something like an email. And they were incredibly successful, right? So it totally changed the world in 10 years. So these are the top companies by value in 2006, I believe. And then 10 years later, these are the top by value. And you can see that some companies just totally emerged, and among them were Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, and Facebook, right? With just huge values and a huge amount of value, but that they were actually creating in the world and they were actually extracting from their users. So this is really important. But some concepts have been sort of understood about what centralization does and how companies that are centralized have a relationship with their users. And so this is from a really great blog post that I recommend you to go read, and the link is here, and I'm happy to give it to you afterwards too. But it really is talking about this idea of the current movement towards decentralization. And what the author brings up is this relationship of centralized organizations with their users. And one of the things that we see happening a lot is that in the early days of a centralized organization, the entire motive is to bring new users to the platform. And so there's a very good relationship with users because you want a lot more of them. But then what happens is as you cap out the total number of users you can get, your relationship changes because you want to actually extract the most value. The only way that you can grow as an organization anymore is if you stop onboarding more users, and instead you get more value from your users, right? So you turn each user into a source of value. And I think we've seen the impacts of that very, very in our faces in the last couple weeks. But this isn't limited to the largest, most successful companies that are happening. This is actually a movement of most technology over the last 10 years. And even at the startup level, a lot of investors talk about this. And so I think a lot of people in the room will be familiar with the concepts of the network effect, right? So in the Facebook example, the network effect is so clear. If I'm on Facebook and I'm the only user, it's a very lonely place. But if me and one of my friends is there, it's suddenly more valuable, right? And the fact that every new user that comes actually is adding more connections and more edges to the graph, it has a very strong implication on the value of Facebook as a whole. So that's the network effect. And that was the early days of these companies, as they relied a lot on those network effects. But what we've seen is that the network effects have gone deeper, higher, I don't know which direction it is. And we talk a lot now about data network effects. And so this is the world moving into extracting value from their users. So right, you say every new user can give me more data, and I can train better machine learning, and I can have the best algorithms from that data. And so that's actually leading to new value in a company. Okay, and so a lot of startups are trying to figure out how they can get data network effects, right? That's centralization. That's the effect of centralization on organizations. I think this is a really nice way to think about it. If you have an organization that operates that way, these centralized systems have data gravity, right? So if every new piece of data is adding more value, you start wanting to accumulate more and more of it. You seek new ways to get more of that data. Another really nice website that, or a research group that has broken a lot of this down. This is from one of their publications. It's from 2 years ago, showing some of the amounts of data that Facebook had and was making operational. Right. One of them, I guess, really relevant to you, and from this morning, 17 billion location tag posts in 2016. But that's not their only source of data, right? They're not just getting data from when you go and make a post, right? This is a sample of all their different data partners. But that's not it. It goes on and on and on. And their actual reach for getting data is pretty profound. A company called Ghostery, they make a plugin for your browser. They did a study where they found nearly 80% of websites had trackers of some sort. That means like a third party on that website to collect your data and share it with somebody who wants to create value from it. 15% of pages are monitored by 10 or more. If you've ever had one of those plugins that shows you all the places trying to track you on a website, you see that they go off like it's like a casino. 60% of page loads contain scripts from Google, 27% page loads contain scripts from Facebook. I did some like basic analysis of this at one point about a month ago, and if you actually do the mathematics of that on a graph, right, if I know 60% of the traffic, I can actually infer quite a lot more from page exits and page leave events. So the actual knowledge about browsing behavior alone is much higher than this. And I got really interested, so I started a newsletter. This talk isn't about the newsletter, but if you are interested in it, it's called Data Goes Bang. And the concept of it wasn't to think about privacy or any of those concepts. It was just to try to figure out where our data is going, right? So if 80% of websites have trackers, where does that data go? And it's funny, almost every edition of the newsletter had some information about Facebook that I was finding, oh, this is a new way that they're collecting data, and that's really interesting. And then about a month ago, right, it sort of blew up. And it became very apparent where our data is going. And I think the issue that's more interesting here is our agency around our own data. So I didn't choose to have my data be part of the U.S. election. I didn't choose to have it sold to these different agencies or these different campaigns to be used for their strategies, right? So I lost control of my data. Okay, so that's a little intro to my sort of biased perspective of centralization. But like I said at the beginning, a lot of really great things came out of this. It's just where we are now is leading to something different. But I think also super interesting is that the modern geospatial industry was born into this period of centralization, right? It had to be, because in 2000, this is one of my favorite things, right? In 2000, the accuracy that was allowed to be collected from GPS satellites was switched to the accurate mode, right? So it was sort of like the day before the left side of the graph, the accuracy you could get from on any GPS device as a normal citizen was about a football field. It's practically useless for most of what you are all doing today. And then overnight, they switched it so civilians could use high accuracy GPS signals, and it's about the accuracy of your kitchen counter. That's profound, and that was only in 2000. Right, and then in the mid-2000s, something that we're all using, right, is the data that comes from mobile devices. And so a lot of what we're doing with geospatial data and the derivatives from it are only coming from this period right now. Right, and our understanding of flow and movement and street traffic and real-time data, they're all really brand new. And so this has a really big impact on the way that we think about data collection, the ownership of that data, and where that data can go. So one thing that I think is really interesting is a lot of the geospatial industry never really had this prior history of being decentralized first. I know you can think of some examples of it, but let me give you something that I realized in kind of writing this presentation that can kind of make an example of it. Is in this period of decentralization for the internet, the picture at the top, they came up with things like TCP/IP, HTTP, SSH, SMTP. So these are all fundamental protocols for how you send a packet of information on the web, how you identify where a website or a server is on the web, how you send an email to somebody else that you have an address to. And these are all still around today and drive most of the communication that you're doing on the web, whether it's to a server or another individual. But geospatial technologies don't really have these protocols. So if we had had that period before, it seems pretty obvious to me that there would be a protocol for sharing information around points of interest, around streets, around traffic. These are fundamental basic units of geospatial technologies that were born into a centralized period. So there's singular organizations that own the flow of this data that try to aggregate it and create information on top of it. And most of the companies that we've seen grow up in this period are fundamentally centralized, right? They're trying to pull this data in. They're trying to get the data network effects and build value on top of it. And really great things have happened in this period. And so I don't mean to say that that's bad. I think it was a very important period and it had to happen. But also I think it's really important for this community to be aware that if these ideas around centralization are true, there's a period coming when the value isn't going to be derived from more and more people coming to our platforms anymore and more people participating in the creation of maps or the creation of data sets anymore. It's going to be actually flipping and extracting value from those people. And I think we already see a lot of examples of this. But it brings to mind this question is, does the geospatial industry have the Cambridge Analytica moment coming? Perhaps we already skirted a small problem just recently because it was overwhelmed by that news, which was the idea that Strava had all this data about where military bases were around the world, and people were just giving that information to the centralized organization who then made the choice about what to do with that data, which was make a map and put it out in the world, which actually could have led to some serious security risks for some people, right? That's kind of how the flow of information works. So maybe something to think about there. But let me ask you a few questions to make this more clear about the geospatial community, the geospatial technologies community existing from this centralized world. How many of you have been reminded, just by a quick show of hands, where your parking spot was on Google Maps? So you open Google Maps back up and you find your car marked on the map, right? Okay, so how many of you have shared a ride or a run on Strava? How many of you have tracked every run you've ever taken? Okay, a couple of you. How many of you have a copy of that data? I know you do, I know you do. How many of you have a record of every place you've ever been? Okay, let me make that easier. How many of you have a record of every place you've ever been in the last 5 years? You have a copy of that? Ah, exactly. You don't control that geospatial data. Somebody else is collecting it. It's going to them. They're extracting the value of it. They're choosing what to do with it. And you probably aren't ever going to see it again. Okay, so what can we do? Well, maybe nothing. Maybe that's the world we exist in, and that the value that we're getting from it and the technology that's being built on it is good and working well. But it seems that in technology, if I'm right about this pendulum, the pendulum is already swinging the other way. There's a lot of technology being built, and there's a lot of communities being built around that technology that's very interested in this idea of decentralization now. I think that this modern wave of decentralization really starts in 2009 with the idea of Bitcoin. So decentralized technologies have always been there. They've always been around. You can think of things like BitTorrent, for example. But Bitcoin really kicked off a new group of people being very excited about this, and some new ground level applications being built on decentralized technologies, and I think very important, a lot of new capital coming to decentralized technologies. But I'm sure all of you are aware of Bitcoin, but other things exist too. So how many of you are aware of CryptoKitties? Anybody here own a CryptoKitty? Nice, nice. Well, so this is a really interesting idea, because what this actually allowed people to do is own digital information, right? You own your cat, your CryptoKitty, and you get to choose what to do. You choose who you breed your cat with, who you sell your cat to, who you buy it from. It's totally decentralized. They have a bit of centralization around the rendering of the cats, but if the company that built this went away tomorrow, you would still actually own that information. It's in a digital wallet that nobody else can control. That sort of decentralization has led to some really neat things and a really big group of people building it. So things like Ethereum has maybe the largest developer community on a decentralized technology, has a market cap of something like $40 billion today, something like that. But their idea is really to build a general application layer that runs on blockchain. So this is like a large decentralized compute. A smaller organization called Open Bazaar, it's decentralized peer-to-peer purchasing. So think eBay with no eBay. You want to buy something and it's there and you buy it directly from the other person selling it. IPFS is a technology that we're using a lot. It's decentralized file storage, right? So why do you have to have a lot of centralized CDN peers, CDN servers that serve content? Why can't you just get the content from a person across the room who also just loaded it? But IPFS is very deep. That's sort of one application of it. And then on top of IPFS, the organization that started IPFS started a coin called Filecoin, which will allow you to actually purchase storage space from different servers around the world, and then a couple others. And the reason that these communities are being built around these technologies is that that graph, the S-curve that I showed you before of how centralized systems often attract a lot of early users through direct value to those users, and then flip it and start extracting value from those users. That's what Chris Dixon calls the bait and switch of centralized organizations, and it's something they tend to go through a lot. And developers and communities related to those developers are coming to these crypto networks, as he calls them, because that bait and switch actually is encoded in the systems not to happen, right? There's a set of rules that the systems run by, and nobody can change those rules. There's no central authority that can say, actually, now we're going to switch our business model and do it this way. And I think that if decentralization comes to the geospatial community, we're going to see a lot of these principles built up around some of these missing core concepts. And so this is something I think worth people here to think about. What happens if we can decentralize the collection and the validation of things like points of interest or street traffic? These are things that don't need a huge coordinated effort where everybody is coming to the room and planning. We already understand the concepts of points of interest. We already understand the concepts of real-time street traffic, and we're all contributing to it all the time. So it's just how do we manage that, and can we do it in a decentralized way? And with this pendulum swing back to decentralization, it's not sort of a militant thing that says everything that was centralized is going to become decentralized. It's actually let's think about this and decentralize with purpose. What things are centralized now that shouldn't be centralized? And can we now use a lot of the technologies that are being built and proven as working with as decentralized systems and bring them to these new problems? So how many people in the room? So we all work on either directly on data collected from people or on derivatives that come from those data or analyses on top of those data. So I'm just curious, from a community that's so hands-on with this data, how many of you are actually personally concerned about companies collecting data and where that data goes. So quite a few of you. And so that's awesome. That means that this community has people that are both working on it and working on figuring out solutions. And so now I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're working on, and I'll blast through this because we're trying to build decentralized systems for personal data, which is really important to us because we think that personal data in a centralized system is always going to be subject to this bait and switch. But we all want our personal data to be part of systems that sort of respect our privacy and respect our right to choose where that data goes. And as society moves more and more into a technological society, it's going to be so important that we understand our relationship with personal data a lot more, right? It's going to become much more important, and it's going to become much more personal. How many of you have a digital wallet of any kind? So that's a great place for us to start telling you what we're up to. How many of you are familiar with the concept of a digital wallet? So for Bitcoin or for Ethereum or for your CryptoKitties. So the idea of the digital wallet for, say, Bitcoin is that that's your place to actually securely store your ownership of coins. The concept there is really around encryption, but you can think of it as your way that you can, without any centralized authority, you can have some stake of Bitcoin that nobody else can transact with, nobody else can use. But we think that those same concepts can be applied to personal data. So at a high level, what we're trying to build is a digital wallet for your personal data. So when I asked you before, how many of you had a database hanging around with all of your locations from the last 5 years, I think it's really interesting that none of us do, but there's at least a handful of companies in the world that are trying to. Okay, so why, if we're going to be more proactive about choosing what happens to our data, why don't we have copies of it? Why don't we have the original source of that data? But if I gave you today, if I said, go use this digital wallet to store all of your digital data, how many in the room would go and download that? A couple of you, and that's awesome. I want to talk to you after. You're too trusting. But most of you, probably not. It's something that maybe we don't totally understand the ideas of the personal wallet. Maybe we're not totally sure what the value of collecting our data is yet. And these are problems we're trying to tackle. So we're trying to tackle ideas of education, understanding what it takes to get people to think more about their personal data. But really, we've gone through a big thought exercise trying to figure out what kinds of personal data do people already care about and understand concepts around. And one of the things that we realized is that there's one kind of data that all of us understand, or all of us have a sense of ownership over. We already have a feeling of the need for privacy around, and we already understand value related to it, and that's just photos. So all of us think of digital photos not as data, but as something quite different. And so our first product is actually, you can find it at textile.photos. What it does is it populates, behind the scenes, it populates a digital wallet of your data, in this case, just photos at first. And that digital wallet lets you do some things. It lets you back up and store those photos for long term, sort of like the iPhotos, but in a decentralized system. So if we disappear tomorrow, your photos are still safe. And it also lets you share those photos and communicate them to the people that your friends or your family. Again, in a decentralized system, which is really interesting because it lacks that central authority. We can't do things like snoop on what you're doing. We can't look at your photos, and we can't censor what photos you're moving around. So it's decentralized, it's storing, it's sharing, it's secure, and it's open, but fundamentally underneath, it's this digital wallet in a decentralized system. Already, when you use our application, it asks for your permission to use your location data, but that's not because we're collecting it. We use some properties in the phone that allow the app to always be grabbing your latest photos. And when you move around, location on mobile devices is a really nice way to keep the app in the background to do those tasks. But we see it as a really neat thing that very soon we can say, would you actually also like to store that data? Would you like to have a copy of your location data? So for this for this room, I don't want to talk a lot about our current product, the Photos product. I want to think about our next movements into things like geospatial data. So imagine a world where you did collect every coordinate you ever had. And you actually could transact with those coordinates. So instead of an organization saying, I want to track this person and know as much as possible about all the data that they create, they want to instead they can actually ask to use your data. What's so cool about that is that organizations that you trust could have a way better picture of your data. And if they used algorithms that had ways of using that data that you also trusted, they were transparent, they didn't steal that data, they didn't share that data with third parties, you might be much more incentivized or much more willing to let them have that picture in order to get the outcome that they're saying that they need it for. So instead of thousands of companies online trying to track your data all the time and something like 7 out of 10 mobile apps that you install trying to get your location data and who knows where it goes, you actually can control that original source of data and you fully control that single source of truth. So if decentralization is right, and we're right that it might have these impacts on the way that we think about personalized data, personal data, for you in the geospatial industries, what would the impact be on your analyses, on the way that you get information from that data? And I think it would be quite different, and I think it would be really interesting and probably lead to a lot of new types of knowledge. And I think it's going to demand us to rethink the way that we've built a lot of these systems in the sort of shadow of the centralized world, right? So instead of having the flow of our personal data go to these centralized organizations, them choosing what derivatives to create and then selling those derivatives, we could all be active participants in that value. So I was thinking of this morning the idea of real-time census data. If we all controlled our own information and could get guarantees about how that information was being used, a large number of us could actually participate in things like real-time census where we were happy with the outcome. And so that's what I want to leave you with, are just some thinking ideas about how this swing is happening, that it is happening, and then get you thinking about how we might build new technologies around it. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, and I mentioned a couple things. Those are the links on the left. Thanks very much.